Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, our fifth and final webinar in our series on credentialing. My name is Eric Marshall. I serve as the Executive Director of PDG. And again, thank you all for taking the time and joining us today. Few housekeeping matters before you jump in. If you've been with us for these previously, you know that we're using an ordinary Zoom platform for this to facilitate questions and answers towards the end of the session. Please do be thinking about those questions that you may have. Feel free to throw those in the chat as we go through the program. We will likely hold them for the end, but please do feel free to begin throwing those in the chat throughout the session or to join us off mute at the end of the session to ask those questions. Please do stay on mute and off video if you could while we go through the formal presentation portion until we get to that Q&A piece. Finally, just a reminder that today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the PDG website, along with a copy of the slides for anyone who is looking to access those. As I mentioned, this is our fifth and final webinar in our 5-part series. You can see there the prior episodes that we have covered. And again, all 4 of those recordings with their materials are available on the PDG website if you did not have a chance to join those. Again, that's dscsagovernance.org/blueprint. Today is our 5th session on credentialing, as I mentioned, and I'm glad to be joined today by a couple of guests who will be part of the conversation here today. First, Nirmal Ananreddy, project manager at Genentech, and also serves as one of our co-leads of our credentialing work group within PDG. And so we're excited to have Nirmal with us to provide a manufacturer and industry perspective throughout the conversation. And then, of course, as always, Bob Celeste, founder of Supply Chain Studies, and an advisor with PDG, helping to facilitate our work groups, including our credentialing work group and the work that was done in that group over the last year and a half or so. So Nirmal, Bob, thank you both for joining us and being part of the conversation. Just a couple of quick pieces of background for those who may not be familiar with PDG, or if this is your first time joining one of these sessions. PDG, or the Partnership for DSCSA Governance, is a collaborative forum of industry and an FDA public-private partnership focused on developing, advancing, and sustaining effective and efficient models for interoperable tracing and verification under the DSCSA, primarily focused on those new requirements coming online in November 27th of this year. For more information, you can visit our website listed there on the slide. Ultimately, the power of the PDG organization lies in our membership. We have a robust and large membership spanning all sectors of the supply chain, as you can see here, including solution providers who are critical to this activity as well. And they have been working tirelessly over the last year and a half to develop these new functional design chapters of the blueprint, and we're grateful for their work and engagement. To that point, on the next slide, that the culmination of their work over the last, again, almost 2 years now is really these new functional design chapters of the blueprint. And so you can find those again on our website, dscsagovernance.org/blueprint. And on this credentialing chapter in particular, chapter 6, you'll find 2 fact sheets. Again, these are short synopsis of the various chapters in hopefully more digestible form, as well as one really drawing out some of the key themes of the chapter and the role of digital credentials. So I encourage folks to go view that chapter, read that chapter closely, and look at all of the details down to the footnotes, but also note that there are those assisting fact sheets available on our website as well. Next slide, please. Ultimately, among any of the chapters, this is certainly one of the more technical topics and subjects. So to the extent you're really just trying to get a hold of the surface and understand why this is important, I think is as much as the detail and content in that chapter is to recognize the process that went into developing the blueprint overall, including this chapter 6. This chapter, in these chapters across these functional design, were the result of more than 275 work group sessions, more than 10,000 member man hours dedicated to this process and consensus development, input from every sector, engagement from the FDA, running through multiple layers of work group, committee, and ultimately membership approval through our voting structure to ensure sector neutrality and balance. And so again, while a lot of the details may be technical here and you may just be starting to scratch the surface, above anything, I would emphasize the process that went into developing this document. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that you've probably seen before, kind of highlighting how these chapters fit together, and it's particularly relevant to this chapter 6 on credentialing. So chapter 1, again, was really those foundational business and compliance requirements published in 2021, and then those 5 additional chapters building upon it focus on the functional design. And so chapter 2 provides an overarching vision of that functional design, and then we've covered 3, 4, and 5, and today we're digging into chapter 6 on credentialing and user authentication. But the piece to note there is you'll see that green bar on credentialing and user authentication sits underneath a verification and tracing. This is an enabling tool, this credentialing tool, right, to enable more efficiency in that PI verification process and that tracing process. You'll see that blue bar, or that green bar, at least in the non-expanded view here, does not stretch underneath that blue box representing TI and TS exchange. So as we think about this credentialing piece, it's really a tool used in verification and tracing. We have not designed our functional design, and we have not generally approached credentialing as PDG, at least, as something that we've tried to apply to TI and TS exchange. Sure, it may extend there, and organizations may take it there, but we have not focused on it as a requirement to extend the TI-TS exchange component, because that TI-TS exchange activity is occurring between commercial trading partners in the context of a commercial relationship. Whichever sector you sit in, you have deep relationships with your suppliers or customers. You go through an onboarding process, you vet those customers, go through a deep commercial contract to put those arrangements in place, et cetera. You have an assurance in that commercial relationship that of who is on the other end, and that you want to be selling them your product or buying product from them. You don't need this added layer of credentialing necessarily to make that happen. Again, maybe there's future efficiency to move there, but that's not been our approach in thinking from a compliance and functional perspective. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with just a couple of key pieces of terminology as we get into this conversation. We have on the left are a couple of terms that were in the first chapter of our blueprint with with the compliance and business requirements: credential and credentialed. Credential, as we use that term in PDG, is a tool by which an organization can demonstrate that it meets a set of requirements, assuring others that that entity is both identity proofed and authorized, by which we mean the two components of that credential: identity proof, a way of demonstrating you are who you claim to be, and authorized, really meaning that statutory requirement to be duly registered or licensed as required in the statute. And so, right, so for example, if you're Joe's Pharmacy, this credential is a way of demonstrating that you as Joe's Pharmacy are actually Joe's Pharmacy, and not a Russian hacker sitting in a basement somewhere, and that you're authorized, that you hold a current and valid license within the state in which you're operating. Credential then is really just having demonstrated that through this credentialing process. So agnostic in that regard to how you go about executing that credential or what the tool is. To the right, then you'll see a similar but different term, digital credential. And this is a term that you'll see used a lot in chapter 6 of our blueprint. And we use that term digital credential really to refer to W3C verifiable credentials as we've applied them to the PDG network, or as they've been applied to the PDG network by OCI's open specifications. We'll get into the details around that being one methodology and why we view that as one valuable methodology for achieving credentialing. But I just want to really emphasize and highlight here that we are very careful and intentional throughout this conversation to distinguish credential, a process and a tool that's agnostic to how, versus digital credentials, one more modernized digital interoperable way of doing that credential processing. Another thing that I'll just emphasize on this as well about this notion of credentials is that we've been very careful in our conversations and intentional to highlight that a credential is a way of demonstrating that you are an authorized trading partner and identity proofed, but the inverse does not necessarily hold true. The lack of a credential does not necessarily mean that you are not an ATP. So if I use my Joe's Pharmacy analogy again, right? If Joe's Pharmacy says, I don't have a credential, but I need to get this information from you for DSCSA purposes, that lack of a credential doesn't mean that they're not an ATP and can't get that information. It just means you may need to move into a more manual process to look and understand whether Joe's Pharmacy is a legitimate actor that you want and should be engaging with. The last thing that I'll really emphasize on this notion here is this is activity, this credentialing process and credentialing activity is something that you all are doing today. I'm confident of it, right? Whether you know it or not, intentionally or informally or formally. If you were working in your business today and you got an email from Joe Smith at the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy saying, hey, send me your product information on this product that you bought or sold a few months ago, I don't think many, and hopefully none of you, would just automatically respond and shoot him a bunch of information and data, right? You're at least going to look and say, does his email address look legitimate, or is it Mr. Joe at corruptcorp.com, right? Or whatever it might be, right? You're going to look at the email address. You might go poke around and see, does Joe Smith actually work at the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy? You might call the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy and say, hey, we got this request. Can you confirm that it's valid, right? You're doing some sort of process today on a one-by-one basis to say, somebody's asking me for information and I'm going to think through my mind, is this somebody, are they legitimate, and is it somebody I should be giving information to? What we're really talking about in the blueprint is really just bringing standardization and interoperability to that process. So in some ways, there's a lot of new stuff here, but in some ways as well, this is an underlying practice that, again, formally or informally, I would guess that virtually all of you are doing today. And we're going to talk here through the session today about a few reasons for that, how the statute adds some authorized components, what security means, how volumes are going to change and drive some of this. So that's kind of where we'll turn next. Next slide. If folks, if you're only able to pay attention to 2 or 3 minutes of this session in one slide, it's this one. So I hope people will kind of focus in on this one to get a snapshot of what is in the PDG blueprint. In chapter 1, we really focused there on setting that base threshold for what it means to be an authorized trading partner who is identity proof and can access or engage in electronic interactions in this new DSCSA environment. So what is that threshold for saying, yes, if you've checked these boxes, we're going to consider you authorized and identity proof? Those are set out in chapter 1. If you click one more ahead, the other thing that is in chapter 1 then is this emphasis on having a process, requiring a process to confirm and convey that threshold has met. Again, back on the terminology side, it was that left side of the screen. Our blueprint really emphasizes and requires that people have a process to confirm that those thresholds are met to assure authorized and identity status. This new chapter, chapter 6, then, if you click ahead one more, really then lays out the options for how you can go about carrying out that credentialing process. And while you'll see that there's a lot of attention and a lot of detail and really valuable detail in chapter 6 about digital credentials, we do emphasize that is one way of implementing and carrying out that kind of a credentialing process. So you may use that digital credential process, or you may use alternate processes. They may be other electronic processes. They may be manual processes where you're just kind of on a one-by-one basis try to manually track who's an ATP, et cetera. So while there's a lot of attention given in the blueprint to that digital credential side, we do really emphasize that that is one of the ways that that can be met, because we all know there's going to be an adoption curve and there's going to be kind of a learning phase as people come on board, and we believe they begin to gain traction in business value over time. So I want to kind of at that point, and kind of given this is a really important kind of concept here, bring Bob and Nirmal in. And so Nirmal, how are you thinking about that in terms of, you know, the process versus that more digital credential? And then, you know, Bob, you've done a lot of work on this too, and jump in with your thoughts also.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And actually, you laid out very well, you know, on all these previous slides. You know, I personally feel like, you know, like to put in more of layman language, you know, the process of credentialing, you know, considered a cross-border checks. You know, you will need to present your identity along with that a certificate or a permit, you know, that authorizes you to cross a border. So I feel the credentialing is almost similar. You know, credentialing is primarily it's to necessitate an electronic interaction between the trading partners who do not have direct relationship or who are like indirect direct partners. There is value and efficiency gain in here. It's just not that, you know, they have a license, but it also checks if they are truly who they are. You know, the goal in terms of, you know, where we want to get to this place of interoperability world is, you know, when a manufacturer, you know, considering any trading partner who get a request, or, you know, call it like verification or tracing, we have the confidence that the requesting entity is a licensed entity, and the requests are coming through our system with these digital credentials, and we are able to exchange and respond in a more secure and seamless manner.
Thanks, Nirmal. Very helpful. Bob, you were part of kind of putting all this thinking and even the framework here together. What would you add at the high level of kind of how we've approached this in the blueprint across chapter 1 and 6?
Eric, I would say it's really important to understand the definition that's in chapter 1 around credentialing. And as you stated, it is a process that a trading partner would go through in order to determine the identity and whether they're the entity that's asking for information or providing information is who they say they are and is an authorized trading partner. And that can be handled manually. What we've laid out here in chapter 6 is again that to be used in an electronic system, and that I think would be driven mostly from efficiencies. If you think about the number of trading partners you may electronically interact with, over time, that manual process might become tedious. It's hard to document the manual process. And so this is just more of an efficiency and security perspective in what we've laid out as far as the digital credentialing.
Yeah, Bob, you hit a few buzzwords in there that I think we're going to kind of expand on. So it's a great segue, right? As you think about this, right? The reason we have this emphasis on digital as an option, but one that we believe will become increasingly valuable and efficient over time, is a fewfold, right? One, the statute and some of what it requires, and the emphasis on security, and then volumes and this emerging interaction between indirect trading partners. And so I want to touch on kind of each of those themes here next. So if we can flip forward one slide. First, just a couple of statutory pieces, right? A lot of the language in the DSCSA statute talks about interacting with, providing information to, responding to requests from authorized trading partners, with an emphasis on that authorized piece. So that's the definition you see on the screen. Shorthand, we often say duly licensed or registered manufacturer, or a wholesaler or dispenser who's generally speaking licensed under the applicable state law. So that authorized emphasis is that one half of the credential. The other half on the next slide is really the emphasis in 582 G1 around security, right? These are the new requirements in 582 G1 that come online for enhanced distribution security in November of this year. And a lot of that is structured around interoperable secure electronic interoperable, really an emphasis on that secure component. And that security piece is really where that identity side of the credential comes in. So next slide. And ultimately, right, a lot of this is really just kind of a recognition that as we become a more interoperable network in 2023, and I recognize there is no single network, right? We've talked about this before. It is a network of network, but it is a network. That network is only as strong as its weakest link. And so part of that is really this importance of having some common definitions and thresholds to ensure that everybody is up to the same bar. Because if 90% of trading partners say, hey, we're going to be really robust in making sure we're careful about who gets access to the network, but then 10% say, we're just going to kind of let anybody and respond to anybody and give our data to anybody and give access to anybody, well, then now everybody's pulled down to that weakest link. And so that's a big part of kind of this emphasis on security and establishing some basic thresholds. And, ultimately, this starts to tie into some important definition work that we did. And this is a really valuable kind of resource that I'll point folks to in the blueprint. And then, Bob Nirmal, but especially Bob, you did a lot of work on this, invite your comments as well. There's an appendix in chapter 6 that really starts to get into how you go about defining, particularly at the state level, what that means to be authorized or licensed. It's easy to look at that authorized definition in the statute and say, well, we'll go to a pharmacy or a wholesaler in the state and we'll say, do you have a license? Show me your license, and then we'll consider them authorized. When you start to dig into that, what you find is it's not as simple as licensed or not licensed. You'll find a whole host of license statuses across the various states. I flipped through and just pulled some out, right, that raise questions. There are statuses like renewal pending, disciplinary limited, inactive, active with partial suspension, delinquent, probation, pending inspection, right? Those kinds of statuses, are we as a supply chain going to consider those statuses to be licensed and therefore authorized and eligible to kind of be part of these electronic interactions? Or is there a reason that we need to treat those as not active licenses and not authorized trading partners and need to treat them in a different way? Here again, I'll really emphasize my point before, right? Which is credentials are intended to be evidence of ATP status. The lack of a credential does not necessarily mean a lack of ATP status. So, for example, you may say, well, we're not going to treat you as credentialed if you have a active with partial suspension. But that doesn't mean that you can't interact with them offline and figure out, okay, actually, we think you are appropriate and we want to share information with you. It's just outside of that mechanism. So again, I want to call people's attention to that tool. And again, Bob, I know you really kind of helped put that tool and table together, along with some of our members who gave a lot of contribution to that. What else would you add on kind of this resource that's in chapter 6?
I think two things. One is that we published this earlier so that the FDA, state boards of pharmacy, can see how we've interpreted how the state boards have speak about licensing, and hopefully this is a good look as to whether someone is an ATP or not based on that particular license. And to your point, you may be licensed in a number of states, and that would qualify you as being an ATP as far as DSCSA is concerned. I don't know of anything else other than that. This was quite a bit of work to go through here and understand what was going on in each state. Some of these statuses were developed over time, not necessarily with ATP at all in mind. And so this is our interpretation of how we would interpret and how an issuer of an ATP credential should interpret these.
Yep. Thanks, Bob. We can jump to the next slide. So again, that's really kind of some of the emphasis on having those common thresholds and how that will drive and bring benefit to this credentialing process. Also, right, the other thing that we believe is going to drive more advancement of this credentialing process really is both the volumes of these interactions. Again, this is applied in verification and tracing. With TH in place, right, we've not seen a lot of tracing activity to date, but we expect that activity will pick up post 2023. And there's been a lot of conversations about how certain activities and potential for data exceptions, et cetera, may drive more verification activity as well. And so we think that activity, those interactions for which you need to confirm ATP status are going to increase. And also a lot more of that activity, and again, we talked about this in some of our other webinars, is going to increasingly point to indirect trading partners, meaning so, right, for example, a pharmacy may contact a manufacturer that they have no commercial relationship with, right? They buy through a wholesaler, so they don't have a direct relationship. They maybe never directly interacted before, but now in an electronic environment, they're going to be asking for certain information or providing certain information under the DSCSA. And so how do you establish the identity and authorized status of that type of an indirect trading partner and potentially do so at scale or at high volumes? So that's the other big driver here, I think, that will start to drive more value into that credentialing process. Nirmal, kind of even just with that example, right? I think you see kind of up front, right, what that potential impact is and the efficiency that can come here. How else would you kind of highlight the value of credentialing in that regard?
Absolutely, Eric, thanks. So what credentialing is effectively something that we do today, like you stated, like in post 2023 November. What you may see is a rise in the volume, and that also is going to need something else, as you're going to have these indirect trading partners, which are thousands in numbers, and is going to be harder to check if you don't have more refined process. I also agree with your point, like how to get there. There is going to be a huge evolution and adoption, that's going to be necessary, especially with our indirect trading partners. As a manufacturer, I'm not expecting that every single request that I'm going to get from an indirect trading partner is going to have a digital credential beginning of 27 November 2023. We as a manufacturers are going to have an obligation, of course, to respond to any verification request, for example. So what are we planning to prepare, for this to identify is like, different sources through which we are going to get these requests. That might be continuing to get it through our product compliance center or customer center, getting an email, getting it through a dispenser who may use a solution provider. I have to understand these different sources. And secondly, I have an existing process, a manual process to respond to this verification request, even if they come without a digital credential. I can see that happening right now, but we're not in a place as of now, like, digital credential is with each of the trading partner. We have, if you consider me in person, like, we have over 40 direct dispensers that we are in process to onboard them, and none of them at least know what a digital credential is. I'm talking about 40 who are direct dispensers. Let's talk about indirects, like, we do not have any relationship with them, and we're talking about, hundreds and thousands in numbers. So I would see, like, again, I would like to emphasize the same point, the importance of credentialing process in one way is to get through a digital credential, most importantly, to have more secure exchange and secure, response in either ways, like in trading partner at the interoperable world.
Great. All good comments and great framing there from a practical perspective, Nirmal. Thank you. If we jump to the next slide, this is where, Bob, I'm going to start to pass the baton to you as the technical guru around a lot of this. And so, again, within that process emphasis, we've really spent a lot of time in Chapter 6 detailing out the digital credential component. Again, not as a mandatory, but as one of the efficient ways of carrying out that kind of a process. But it is complex, and so you'll see a lot of detail in there. And so, Bob, I'm going to kind of pass to you here to orient people a little bit to the high level of what they'll find with regard to digital credentials in Chapter 6 there.
Sure. So we wanted to make sure that if companies are using these digital credentials, that they're secure, and you could determine whether there's been any tampering with them, all of the kind of security pieces of that. And so we started with using the W3C is the standards body for the World Wide Web, the internet, and they've developed standards around decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, and then how you would present those credentials to another entity and keep them secure. So building on top of that and applying that to the specific use case of DSCSA and specifically for PI verification and tracing, OCI has created open source specifications that anyone can use that takes those standards and applies them to our particular use case. And then PDG has pulled from all of that and referenced all of that in the different chapters of the blueprint. And the teams have been working through making sure that these are able to be applied to those use cases of PI verification and tracing from a security perspective and from a systems interoperability perspective. So that's our stack of standards. I think you could probably add on here, I probably should have added this in the standard side. We also use NIST standards, and we also take advantage of GS1 standards in the identifiers.
Thanks, Bob. Feel free to keep rolling on. I think the rest is kind of your technical sweet spot. So if you want to go ahead to the slide, Zach, no problem.
Yeah, so here's a bit of an eye chart, but what this says to the PI verification community. And so we're talking about an existing community of verification solution providers that are connected to trading partners and doing verifications today for saleable returns, but in November for a number of other reasons that would affect wholesalers, manufacturers, and dispensers. And so this is applying the W3C standards for verifiable credentials to that process. And it introduces a few new solutions, in particular, an issuer of those credentials and what their responsibilities look like and what their interactions with others are, digital wallets, also in holding those credentials and verifying those credentials. And so from a technical perspective, this shows the interaction between all of those players and ensures that the credentials are being used securely and they can be trusted and in order to determine who is actually requesting information, are they an ATP, and oppositely also, who has provided information to you and are they an ATP? So this applies it to PI verification. If we go to the next slide. I think it's interesting to look at, even though we talk about the PDG defined EDDS network, it really is, we've talked in the past about a network of the networks. It's a highly distributed and decentralized set of networks. And so you may find yourself being connected to or using a particular solution or network of solutions for PI verification and for tracing. And yet your message, your either request or your response to a request may need to transit different networks. And so you typically understand the use of a network or a system as having a username and password to be authenticated and authorized to use certain things. In this case, we're using these W3C verifiable credentials are used in that kind of context of proving that you are authenticated, you are who you say you are, and that you are authorized, you are an authorized trading partner. And again, this only applies to the digital network. You know, as we have to keep underlining that credentialing, you can have a discussion with another trading partner if you're requesting information, but this is how we apply digital credentials to a digital network. If we go to the next.
So that brings us through kind of the formal material, but Nirmal, Bob, I want to kind of give you last words while I encourage everyone on the line here, think about questions. If you've got questions, either start to raise your hand or throw them into the chat. We'll turn to that next. But Nirmal, what have we not covered that you think is just really important to highlight on the credentialing front? And Bob, same opportunity. Do you have things to add?
Well, I think from a manufacturer point of view, I think we've covered the most of it. Like, we're talking about, the future state. We're talking about post 27 November 2023, where we, from a manufacturer, we may have to do a PI verification response or PI or trace response with hundreds of different trading partners rather than doing an onboarding manual process, which each one of them individually would take enormous efforts, right? And it's good to have everyone to use, in a more convenient way, like to have this credential, which is one place to go, and also, it becomes more of an inconvenience and more trustworthy and more auditable. It's not, and we understand like it's not a regulatory requirement. It's more of an optimization of a method to have more secure responses and requests coming in within the interoperable system. And I like the way that you put forward, Eric. Each one of us are doing some version of this type of check today. If you get a request from a regulator, you're at least going to look at the email ID, and make sure it's not from maybe nirmal@yahoo.com. You have some process today, formal or informal, that where you kind of do some kind of checks and say who is asking me, and are they really is it a bad player, or should they be really asking this? Are they really authorized to do that? So it's just talking about how you do that at a scale in an electronic interoperable world. Obviously we'll have to dive into every little detail to make sure the technology and industry processes wear out to a trustworthy system, like Bob said. Yeah.
Great points, and a great couple points to end on there, Nirmal. Bob, what else did we miss on the technical side that you would highlight?
Well, I think just a bit of a numbers game. We often say, well, how many PI verifications are there really going to be? How many traces are there really going to be? And we kind of get locked up in that conversation. But if you take a case of what if every dispenser was to verify one of your products from a manufacturer point of view, that could be 64,000 verifications right there. And from a dispenser point of view, or even a wholesaler point of view, you're probably dealing with hundreds of manufactured products. If you were to do that and you were to come back with information from the manufacturer, how many verifications as to whether you actually had reached the manufacturer and all of that does that mean in terms of manual processes? And I think that's why we start to realize that this helps with the efficiencies, with auditability and documentation. And that's where I think where the adoption will start to kick in.
Great points. Thanks, Bob. That is the end of the formal comment. As questions come in, I'll just remind folks, this is the last in our series, but this recording and the other recordings are all available up on our PDG website, along with the blueprint materials that encourage everybody to go review it and review carefully.